I want to introduce our speaker for today. He's kind of a legend around here at Multnomah. A lot of people call him Papa, I think, or something similar to that. He's the chair of the Biblical Language program here. I love to hear him speak in Hebrew. It just moves my heart. I heard him do the Shema at a wedding, and it was awesome. Karl is going to come and share about the book of Job and suffering. So let's give it up for Dr. Karl Kutz.
You always have to... Whoa. This will resonate with you. Aha. You always have to approach with a certain degree of trepidation when somebody asks you to talk about suffering. And they give you the book of Job and 30 minutes. Actually, last night I laid in bed until about 3 in the morning, trying to figure out how to take all of these thoughts and how to bring them together. Trying to share with you about the book of Job is not just about trying to communicate information about what a biblical book says, as much as it is the intersection with life. And every one of us has something that brings deep pain. If there's anything that I've discovered over the course of my life, it's the fact that the more that you get to know people, the more you realize that every single individual wrestles with something, and that there's always, as our theme says, the necessity to live the question. And many times we find that there doesn't seem to be an answer. My own story begins in a Christian home with all sorts of blessings that come from being part of that kind of a family. I came to Multnomah, ended up in ministry for about 4 years before I headed to graduate school. And it was in graduate school that my life kind of crashed, and I began to have to deal with my questions. I'd been married for about 5 years by the time we went to graduate school. And when we were there, the first thing that hit me was changes in my wife's health. My wife's health just absolutely tanked, and we ended up beginning a journey that lasted 33 years of chronic pain, deep depression, the emotional, mental issues that come into play with that have left a mark in my life that I can't even describe to you because I don't even understand it anymore. There's so many things that have just been wiped from my mind. I can't remember that. I have certain scenes and things that impact me with regard to that. At that time, I was also going through graduate school and having to deal with issues at school related to what I believed about the Bible. So on the one hand, I had the crises of illness and chronic illness at home that made me wonder where God was, and at the same time found myself not understanding what I should believe or what I should think about things that I had been taught. So I ended up going through a journey that took me probably 4 years where I rethought every single thing that I believed, including the existence of God, in terms of what I believed about Scripture. And in the middle of that, I remember many times people would ask us how we were doing because they weren't necessarily aware of what was going on mentally in my mind with my theological questions as much as they were with what was going on in our family with my wife's health. And I remember telling them, we're doing well, we're waiting on God, and I gave all those answers that you're supposed to give. And then I remember after a particularly long period, it was probably 4 years in which my wife struggled with deep, deep depression, and where I learned to dissociate. I learned to listen and not hear a thing, and to stare out the window and somehow be present but not present at the same time. I remember one day, it was in New Year's. There was snow on the ground. I could still see the trees out the window. And I remember looking outside, trying to drown out out the things that my wife was saying, and I couldn't keep them at bay anymore. And I stood up and I just started screaming at God. There were no answers. There was nothing. And at that moment, there was something that changed in the sense that I was no longer trying to assert what I wanted to believe. I was asking for help to believe. I still have not completed that journey. My life has not taken me where I thought it would ever take me. And I'm still trying to figure this out. And so today, when we look at the book of Job, I'm not really talking to you, I'm talking to myself. And hopefully you get to listen in and you get to hear some things that will be helpful. Most of the time when we look at the book of Job, we read the prologue and we hear about all these things that happened to Job. And we finish chapter 2, and then we really hate poetry. And so we go to the end of the book, and lo and behold, he gets okay at the end. And so we put those two things together, and we come up with a composite that, while helpful, I'm not sure that it adequately captures what the book of Job can give to us. It shortcuts the process. We do learn that bad things happen to good people, and we already know that from our own experience. We can see it happen in our own lives and the lives of those around us. We also know that God is responsible, whether we want to frame it in terms of, the theological concept that God gives his permission for bad things to happen, or whether we're willing to embrace what the book of Job tells us, that God actually started that whole mess and said, oh, by the way, have you taken a look at my servant Job? Why don't you test him? And then later on, when Satan comes before God, and God says, hey, by the way, how's it been going with my servant Job? He still holds fast his faith, even though you incited me against him without cause. There's an ownership that God takes it's beyond just permissive. God is a father. And just like my human father, he takes us through the events of life, and sometimes they are his initiation. They're always on his initiative as he tries to shape us into the kinds of individuals that he wants us to be. And I think on one level, it helps that we can recognize that God is responsible because we trust him. And if we're not just simply in a world that is dictated by God having to put up with things that he really doesn't want to happen, but it's all under God's control, somehow that makes sense. I also find that there's a reason why. I may not know why, but just as Job doesn't get to see why he has to go through what he goes through, neither do I. But we get to look into the life of Job. We get to see this scene in heaven. It's the most bizarre of scenes. Satan and God are having a dialogue and a dispute about what righteousness looks like. And there is a reason why Job is going through what he goes through. He never gets that answer. He never gets to find out what it is. I think a lot of times we spend so much time trying to figure out what the lesson is that we're supposed to learn and what it is that's the cause behind it all, that we often don't just let go and just say, look, unless God shows it to me, I don't need to know. But at least I can rest that there is a reason. And then we also learn that reward comes to those who wait. We get to the end of the book, and it says that God restored Job. In fact, in the book of James, it says this, as you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance, and you have seen what the Lord finally brought about, that the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. At that point, I find myself feeling a little bit like I've been gypped, because it doesn't turn out like that, at least not in my world. The issues that I've been dealing with have gone on for 3 decades. And when you boil those down into years and then months and then into days and whatever, that's not a very comforting thing, because that's not my reality. That's not what I see happening. And I'm sure that a lot of you can resonate with that. You don't have my situation, but you have your own. There are addictions that you wish would just go away and that you would be able to face a day and you wouldn't even feel the pressure or inclination toward those things. But it doesn't change. God may take them away in some people's cases, but not yours. It may be pain, physical pain that just is there every single day, and there's no hope of it going away. It may be emotional pain. It may be loneliness. It can be all sorts of things. And you look at this restoration, you can hold on to it on some level, but there's an angst that comes into play because it doesn't seem to resonate. And I think that part of the problem is that we resort to the same answers to very different questions. We assume that the answer to suffering is the same for everybody. And the book of Job actually is offering a different message, one that applies to chronic pain, one that applies to how you deal with the silence of God, no matter how long that silence may last. There is no guarantee that it's going to change. So how do I deal with this? Well, let's take the prologue, all the bad things that happened to Job, and let's take the epilogue where he's restored and move them to the other side. And let's take a look at what happens in the dialogues, because that's actually what the whole book is about what happens in here. Because think back with me, when we start this whole process, Satan comes before God and he says, look, of course Job is going to worship you. You protect him, you put a hedge around everything that he's got, you take care of him. And he says, you've blessed the works of his hands so that his possessions expand in the earth, but stretch out your hand against him, touch all that he has, and surely he will curse you to his face, to your face. And we kind of just dismiss that because we don't like Satan. That's the bottom line. So we don't pay any attention to him, and yet that is the most fundamental question to the whole book. Why do we follow God? It's a good question. And in order for it to be tested, Job has to lose everything. Now, we read the prologue and we figure we've pretty much seen Job lose everything. He loses all of his possessions, all his flocks, his herds, his children, all in a single day. And he blesses the name of God. And then shortly thereafter, he loses his health. He sits on an ash heap, scraping the pus from the sores that are on his body. He can't even lie down because of how much it hurts. He loses his support structure. He loses his wife, not in the sense that she's gone, but there's that tension there where she's not aiding him in this process as much as challenging his will to continue and hold on. And the friends really aren't a whole lot of help either, except for the 7 days where they sat there quiet. And so, so we realize that he has lost a lot. But here's the thing we don't understand. At that point, he still has everything because he has God. And in order for that question that Satan asks at the opening of chapter 1 and chapter 2 to really be tested, Job has to lose God. Now, it's not a theological thing, okay? We never lose God. He's always there. But you are going to feel like you lose God. And until that happens, you still don't understand or know why you really worship God. It's easy to worship God when you expect that things are going to turn out in a way that matches your expectations, that you're going to see a turnaround or you're going to see some kind of deliverance or whatever. But when you look around you and you see God answering this person's prayer or this person's prayer or this person's prayer, and yours don't seem to be heard, you've not yet fully tested the limits of what it means to worship God for nothing. Now, through the book, that's what happens. At the beginning of chapter 3, there's evidently a fair bit of time that happens before we even get to the first chapter of the dialogues, because at the very end of that chapter, he says, "What I fear comes upon me." And I've been there. I remember the days when I prayed for things for my wife and where I would thank God for things that looked like blessings, and those would be the very things that would be stripped the next day or two. And I got to a point where I was just petrified about what would happen. And you wonder whether God is your enemy, whether he hates you, whether there's something that you've missed. Is there something you could do differently? And I remember that there was a point where I had to grapple with the distinction between submissive hope and resigned despair. Let me see if I can unpack that. I remember that in those moments, it felt so much like no matter what would happen, God had the authority, he had the right to do whatever he wanted. And in that context, I found myself trying to figure out what that meant. How do I let God be God and embrace whatever he has for me? And because of where I was and because of what was coming, the sequence and the logic of saying, I acknowledge God's sovereignty and I am submissive to whatever he has in store for me, took me the next step to which God will do whatever he wants. And the template of what that looked like was nothing hopeful. So I found myself at a point where for months I was really at a loss. I realized that I was facing a crisis because I was at a point where not only did I open my arms to God doing what he wanted, I expected he would and that it would be nothing good. And on some level, there's this tension between being able to let God be God, and then there's also the tension of being able to know that when God allows these things in your life, it is not without the balance of understanding that he loves us. And part of the solution for that came for me by looking at the very epilogue of Job that we talked about a moment ago. I find a certain incongruity and a certain tension in the fact that you get to the end of the book of Job and he's restored, and it causes me a problem because I feel like, why doesn't this happen for me? Yet in that very tension, I also find my hope, because if Job had not been restored, I would have no hope. Because when God put Job through that process, he did it with a specific goal in mind. He says himself, "You have incited me against Job without cause." So he allows Job to go through this thing. There is no reason for him to go through that. And when the testing is over, when he has proven his point, if there was no restoration, God would become cruel. Because he would not be looking out for the well-being of his children. He would instead be doing whatever God wants to do, and it would be totally unpredictable, totally without any kind of root in the character of God, totally random. And the restoration of Job in the book of Job becomes crucial, because I need to know that when push comes to shove and God allows these things in my life, that there is a reason, and that if it were not for that reason, he would bless his children. That he would somehow reach in and he would bring restoration, healing, whatever it is. Now, I've got to be honest, that doesn't bring me a tremendous amount of hope, but at least it's something. Because I can at least rest in the fact that while I will never know why my experience is what it is, while there have been all of these losses, why I have no children, why I have all these different parts that are scars and wounds that are part of this journey, there needs to be a willingness to engage the questions, and if you don't engage the questions, you will find that they will inevitably consume you to the point where you give up. So engaging the questions becomes very, very important. Some of the people that don't engage the question in the book are Job's friends. There's a couple of verses where I think they're quite profound, where Job kind of presses to the point when he says this in chapter 6. He says, like the waters that vanish in the spring, you expect to find a stream of fresh water and it's gone. Thus you, my friends, have turned out to be nothing. You see terror and you are afraid. Part of the reason why Job's friends respond the way they do is because if they acknowledge that Job is righteous, they have to acknowledge that they can go through the same thing. And that's terrifying. Later on in the book, Job says this, surely mockery surrounds me, and my eyes endure their opposition. For God has made me an object of infamy to everyone, and I have become like one to be spit upon in the face. My eye grows dim from grief, my limbs are all like fleeting shadows, and the upright are shocked at this. The innocent man rouses himself against the godless. The righteous man holds firmly to his path. Why? Because he doesn't want to experience what Job experiences. And the one pure of hands strengthens his resolve. Sometimes our theology, the way that we construct things like the friends did, is an attempt for us to somehow figure out how to control God, how to make sure that we don't go through the same situations. And yet we have to live the question. And Job did. And I think one of the things that's amazing is that God allows him to go through that process, and that as we look at his conversations, both with the friends and with God, we find that asking the questions, living the questions, doesn't mean you don't know the answers. And one of the things that scholars debate all the time is why, when you go through the book, Job's tone seems to change. So you've got a cycle of conversations. Job talks, and then Eliphaz, and then Job responds, and then Bildad, and then Job again, and then Zophar. And you have 3 cycles as you go through the book. In the first cycle, each guy gets to talk. And the second cycle, each guy gets to talk. And then when you get to the third cycle, Job does most of the talking, and some of the friends don't talk at all. And some of the things that Job says sound a lot more like the friends. And now we're confused. Because we felt like we were supposed to not like the friends because, the book set us up to like Job and to realize that the friends weren't necessarily saying the right things. And yet we get further along and we find that, whoa, this is a lot more complicated than I thought. And the friends and Job are saying the same things. And why is Job going back to say the things that the friends did? What's going on? And I think part of it is that the author wants us to understand that in all the angst that Job feels, in all the times that he says, God, you must hate me because you don't pay any attention. I feel like if I talked, you're so big that you would just squish me. And yet if I did talk and you did pay attention, you would just refute all my arguments and you wouldn't listen to me. He knows there's an incongruity that he can't get by, and he's willing to wrestle with God. He's willing to cry out and say, God, I don't understand. He's willing to say, God, I think you hate me. He's willing to say, God, I think you must be making a mistake even because this doesn't make any sense. In the middle of all that, God's willing to let him live the question, to ask the questions. Because in the end, you find out he really hasn't gone that far. He just wants an answer. And I don't know that the church does a very good job at allowing you to live the question. In fact, if I were to ask you how free you feel to be able to share about what you really think and about what you struggle with, whether you would feel that freedom and would say, yes, I feel perfectly free to be open with my friends or whatever about where I am. I don't think the church does a very good job of that, because living rightly becomes about what you believe, and what you believe is viewed in a static time and space at each moment of every day. So you're doing well as long as you see things properly now and now and now and now and now, instead of understanding that life is a journey. and that I can struggle with the presence of God, the existence of God. I can struggle with whether or not I believe the Bible. I can struggle with all these things, and that it's okay, and that I need to let people answer those questions. To the extent that I don't let somebody ask those questions, I give the impression that there is no answer. And, I've been at that point. I have felt like there were no answers. And many times when that was the case, it was because people were touting certain kinds of solutions that really didn't make any sense. And somehow I was supposed to accept those solutions as the answer to all. And it didn't work. To the point that I didn't give myself the freedom to acknowledge where I was, to be able to say, I just hate God right now. Yeah, I know that's not a good thing to do. But to the extent that I couldn't do it, I spent all my time not really growing, but simply trying to believe what I ought to believe. When I was in graduate school, back when all these things were just kind of at their first peak, there were several peaks along the way, but at the first one, I had a really good friend. He teaches at Seattle Pacific University now. His name is Rod Stiling. He is a history of science professor. And he and I used to get together and we would talk like once a month. We kind of had our own little club. We never invited anybody else, so I'm not sure it classifies as a club. But it was the Mark 9:24 club. And Mark 9:24, Jesus comes up to a situation. He's been off praying, and a man has brought to the disciples a child that has been demon-possessed, and the disciples can't do anything about it. And Jesus comes up, and the man says, if you can, make him clean. And Jesus says, if I can? All things are possible to him who believes. And he says, I do believe, help me in my unbelief. And that willingness to be able to acknowledge that you're on a journey is sometimes the more profound faith of any kind of faith that you will find. We tend to relegate the answers of Job into very simple categories. In fact, most of the people that I've found who have any comprehension of the dialogues in the center of the book at all go to two passages. One is a passage that's supposedly about the resurrection, and the other is, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the end he'll take his rise and stand upon the earth. And our hope is in Jesus. If it weren't for the fact that the previous verse says, I wish that my words were inscribed in stone and sealed with lead so that someone could read them, because I know that my Redeemer, somebody that would read my words and understand my thoughts and understand that I was right, would vindicate me. He's not talking about the Messiah. He's talking about the fact that he knows that there's somebody out there that would recognize that he was right. We try to put everything into these theological paradigms, and we don't realize this. And I wrote it down because I wasn't sure I was going to be able to articulate it the way I wanted to. And these are the thoughts that came to my mind. In the face of prolonged grief, affliction, and suffering, the expectation that things will be set right in the world to come often brings little consolation. The depths of our current need create a poignant desire for immediate resolution. We cannot endure because we lack strength. We are weary of the struggle, and at such times, words spoken with well-meaning sincerity about peace beyond the grave, restoration in the future, seem incredibly hollow and trite. In fact, an appeal to the world to come in the midst of a crisis between faith and experience where I'm not even sure what I think about God can create further doubt. At times, our theology may prevent us from processing the full scope of crisis brought on by suffering. Those who walk through the darkest of hours know that the hope of resurrection does not dispel the agony of the moment. We are often told in words and in models of what godly suffering looks like that we can face life stoically if only we have the correct answers. Yet a resurrection hope does little to satisfy the frustration and anger of the soul. People need the opportunity to grapple with their relationship with God. They need the chance to cry out to God and ask why He is allowing such things in their life so that they can find resolution. This difference between theology and relationship is an important one. In fact, that's the answer. When you look at the book of Job, the answer is God. Now, I know that sounds kind of theologically trite. The answer is always God, or the answer is always Jesus. You know, the whole Sunday school thing, you go to Sunday school and whatever the teacher asks, it's Jesus. But it really is. God never answers Job's questions. Job never finds out why it happened. And I'm not sure that's what he really wanted. The whole time, his biggest struggle was that God was silent. He needed God to show up. And God did show up. And yes, it's a bit of a challenge. He repents in dust and ashes and with the deepest of contrition that he has not been able to hang on to what he knows about God in the face of the depth of his suffering. But I think he was relieved that God just simply was there. And even though God's words seem to pound down with a bunch of rhetorical questions that just kind of overwhelm Job, if you read them carefully, you'll notice that there's a lot of other things that are embedded in those questions. Yes, indeed, there are elements of those questions where God just says, look, I'm God, you're a man. You've got to just let go. He talks about the greatness of the universe. He talks about the greatness of all the things that he has created and that God can do whatever in the heck he wants. And I do have to come to grips with that. I will have to live with that. But there's also another thread in there that is really, really important. The questions that he asks also talk about God's care. Because when you can't see it in your own world, you have to be able to find the signs of God all around you. He talks about the fact, who is it that marks off the boundary of the ocean, that puts a border in the sand and says, thus far you may come, but no further. He talks about the one who causes the deer to calve in their time each season, the one who takes care of the ravens and all these other animals. And embedded in all these questions that on one level beg the question about who am I, to ask questions of God, there is also the side that says, look all around you. If you're paying attention, you realize that I take care of everyone, and that does not exclude you. The other thing that he asks are questions about wisdom. He talks briefly about who is it that gives to the rooster and to the ibis wisdom so that they know when to crow each day and when they do all these other things. And then he talks about the ostrich and the fact that he takes away wisdom from that particular animal, and it sticks its head in the sand and it does all these other things because God is ultimately also the author of wisdom. And indeed, just before Job encounters God, he has this beautiful poem. It's one of the most beautiful poems in the book. He says, man knows how to probe the depths of the earth and find the most immense riches. He sinks mine shafts deep into the heart of the earth and pulls out sapphires and rubies and gold and all these things. But where can man find wisdom? Where can man search out the ways of God? His ways are hidden. You can ask Sheol, and it says, I've heard a hint of it somewhere, the whisper of what wisdom is, but I don't know. And then he reprises that chorus line, if you will, and he talks about the fact that man has been able to find all sorts of priceless things, but the only place that you can find wisdom is from God. And God declares what wisdom is. It is that man should be blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. And Job realizes that when it comes to wisdom, God is the source of wisdom, and that he has given a very simple answer. Wisdom doesn't come from knowing all the ways of life, not of knowing why your life is the way it is, why you have to walk this path and somebody else doesn't have to. It comes from being able to come before God and for God to say, here's how I want you to walk. This is what wisdom is, and being able to accept it. Now, I don't know where you are in the midst of all of that. I don't know how my journey intersects with yours. All I know is that the words of this book have meant a lot to me because I find that God invites me to live the question. It's okay to ask the questions. It's okay to just simply walk the life of faith, and that faith does not necessarily look like victory as we perceive it to be. I was telling my class the last hour just before chapel, over the years I've found that one of the greatest discouragements to the people of God is not actually what they live, and it's not actually what they learn about God and life. It's the fact that they have lived their whole life with a certain preconception or fantasy about what success looks like in life. And if you understand that life is hard and that God can take you through whatever he wants to take you through, and it can last a long time, but you can still live victoriously in that, regardless of the pain that it brings, regardless of the addictions that you have to battle, that if you can find that, you can see victory in the fact that you walk faithfully with God moment by moment by moment. And that's a huge lesson. It doesn't solve anything. We're not supposed to solve it. We're supposed to understand God and see God. Let's pray. Father in heaven, as we look at your word, we are just humbled by what we face in life and by the questions that just plague us. And Lord, today I just am thankful for the opportunity to reflect back on the book of Job and to think about my own life and my own journey. And I hope that somehow, in some way, just those experiences somehow intersect with each one here. I don't know what pain there is. I don't know what suffering there is, but I pray that, like with Job, that you would simply show up in their life somehow today, or tomorrow, or the next day, that the person beside them who asks a question about their well-being or who buys them a cup of coffee at the cafe or does something that manifests the presence of God and the care of God in their life would simply remind them that you are there and you have not forgotten them. And I pray that you would encourage their hearts. I pray that you would prepare them for the life that they have before them. And we thank you that we do not have to know the struggles that we will face in the days ahead, that we can just live each moment and that we can find strength in you. That power comes in our weakness, that we do not have to somehow put on a facade and appear to walk in a particular fashion, but that somehow as you take us through moment by moment and we find that we have passed successfully to the next day, the next hour, that is what victory looks like, because victory comes through you. And we ask this in Jesus' name, amen.